All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Well, welcome to day number 2 of my Monster a Day art challenge. So yesterday I didn't do a live stream. I did a recorded video. So if you haven't seen that, you can always uh, um, take a look at that at a later time. But basically, I'm doing monsters every day, and this is a bit of a departure from what I've done before. I mean, think about September and all the mixed media stuff that I do, but monsters really are kind of a second part of my artwork, and I do them because they're just so much fun, and so I really encourage folks to make a monster. You don't have to do it the way I do it. You could do it any way that you want, but I'm just going to share my process. Actually, today's going to be very similar to yesterday. I'm just going to use pencil and ink. Just going to do a drawing, but maybe do a slightly different one. And I also put a resource up on the Facebook page that it's a PDF. Actually, I uploaded 2 images so you can kind of take a look at those, or if you wanted to, you could download a PDF, and it's called the Monster Maker Workshop. And it's just a sheet that I developed whenever I was teaching elementary art when I first got into monsters. And it's really just there to kind of help guide you or give you some ideas. It's not a like step by step, here's how you make a monster. And there's a lot of stuff that's kind of left off of that. So it's just sort of like the basic things like the body and the legs and arms and stuff like that. So you can always add whatever you want to your monster. But I was just kind of thinking like, for October, should I continue what I was doing in September, or should I try something new and different? And being October just sort of made me think like, yeah, I got to do monsters. So that's what I'm going to do. And if you're joining in and you want to pop into the comments and say hi, it's always awesome, always great to see where people are tuning in from. And like I was saying yesterday in the recorded video, that monsters aren't just for kids. And I'm not one that does like scary monsters. I do like goofy, silly, grumpy, grouchy monsters. But yeah, I think for me, part of that love of monsters goes back to the Muppets, and that and Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. That those were things that, like, from my childhood that really I think sparked that love of monsters. And then when I rediscovered monsters about 5 years ago, I just fell all in love with them all over again. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and switch over, and then we'll kind of dive into making a monster. Like I said, you can kind of follow along with me, or completely make up your own monster. You could look at that resource that I shared. However, I think it's awesome just to like sit down and make some monsters. So let me go ahead and switch this over. So I've got my drawing paper. Actually, it's not drawing paper. It's the mixed media paper. Same thing that I used yesterday. Even though I'm going to draw on it, it has a nice flat surface, really great for drawing. And then if I decide later that I wanted to paint on it, I could. And I've got my pencil, I've got an eraser, and I've got some of my black pens as well. So I always just start off with I usually start off with a pencil sketch, especially whenever I'm doing these monsters. So I have my paper turned this way. Usually I have my paper up and down because my monsters are a little bit taller. But over the last couple of years, I've explored some monsters that are kind of shorter, maybe chubbier or fatter, or really have big horns and things. So just trying a different format for today's monster. So yeah, I like to start off with the basic shape, and I always kind of think of it in terms of geometric shape. So if I was like, oh, I want to make a kind of a short, chubby monster, maybe it's going to be more of a triangle, but it's not going to be a triangle with really sharp points. It's going to be a triangle with curvy points. And okay, I thought I had that set up. I mean, you might not even be able to see that. Let me go ahead and adjust my lighting. Okay. Oops. Let's see. All right. So I'm trying. Yeah, hopefully you can kind of see that. So I'm trying to keep it light because I don't want to have to do a lot of erasing. And sounds like my wife might be home. our dogs like to bark whenever they think somebody's out there, or sometimes people are actually out there. Okay, so yeah, you can see that. So I've got kind of a triangular shape, but again, it's more rounded because it's a monster. It's a little bit more organic. So if you're just joining in, and you want to pop into the comments and say hi, and maybe say hey where you're tuning in from, it's always great to see where people are. And also, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in, and I try to respond. All right, so this is the body shape, and this upper part's kind of like his head. So that's kind of how I do my monsters, and it's just the way that I do them. And I'm like thinking like maybe he's going to have like really big horns or something like that. So I often just do the eyes next, and a lot of times I like to do like kind of one bigger eye and then one smaller eye. But of course, it's a monster, so you can have as many eyes or as few eyes. So you could have one eye, however many eyes you want to make. And at this point, if it's not a perfect circle, that's okay. It's a monster. And like I was saying yesterday, there are certain things that I do again and again. And this kind of goes back to that notion of style. If you tuned in for some of the September live streams, then maybe you heard me talk a lot about style and like finding your style, and how it's the things that you're drawn to, things that you come back to again and again. And for me, it's the same thing with the monsters. So there are ideas, there were things, there were ways of drawing things that I was drawn to. And so somebody actually, in yesterday's I don't know if it was the video or if it was the image that I shared, but I believe it was Rhonda, had asked, kind of like how did I develop my style? And she asked if I can kind of talk about that. And with the monsters, I mentioned yesterday that I got into monsters because I was teaching elementary art at the time here in Northern Virginia where I live. And I had a fourth grader who was drawing monsters. And it was this time of the year. And monsters really were everywhere, so I was like, they look like fun. And so I decided, well, I was going to go ahead and try to draw my own monsters because they just looked like so much fun. But the thing is, I hadn't really drawn monsters or anything since I was like a little kid. And so what did I know about monsters? So what I did, I just Googled, and I didn't want my monsters to be silly, or not silly, but scary. And I just wanted them to be kind of silly and maybe goofy. And so I looked it up. I looked up like silly monsters and sad monsters and grumpy monsters. And, I saw a lot of like more like horror, like really hardcore, scary kind of monsters. But I kept finding these like cute little like monsters, and I thought, well, okay, I could kind of do that. And so I sat down. I didn't try to copy. There wasn't any artist at that time that I really like stumbled upon and was like, oh, I'm gonna copy that artist. And so I just kind of was looking at like what's making some of these monsters like kind of things that I like. And the first thing I really noticed was like the basic shape of them, that they were these simple shapes, nothing real complicated. And a lot of times having shorter legs, short arms, and so I just really wanted to like, okay, I got interested and I started sketching. I just took some scrap pieces of drawing paper, like just real inexpensive, and I just sketched out. I probably did 10 or 15 to begin with, and some of them I was just like, oh yeah, that's really cool, and others I was like, ugh, and so then I took a few of those to kind of develop them a little bit further. And I drew them, and then I also painted them. So when I first got into monsters, I was drawing them, but I was doing little tiny paintings of them. And I still have a few of those monsters. There's actually one monster that I did that I really liked, and I kept him. But it's really interesting. He's so different than the monsters that I do now. So the monsters I do now really have a style. And so at the beginning, they didn't. The eyes were smaller. I was trying out different things with the eyes, and just all kinds of experiments because I wasn't sure, like, okay, what am I doing? I've never really done monsters before. And so I experimented and tried different things. So after just kind of working with the monsters for a while, um, every once in a while I would take a look online, like, oh, okay, I want to see who's out there, what artists are doing this kind of stuff. And you'd be surprised, there's a lot of artists out there that do monsters. And so I discovered some, and some were a lot more like serious, hardcore, scary monsters, and some people did very cute, grumpy, silly monsters. And what I started doing is like looking at some of the things and thinking like, oh, I really like how that artist did the eyes. So the eyes for my monsters, I was really influenced by a couple different artists that I just kind of liked the way they did their eyes. But I didn't try to copy, so I wasn't trying to make a monster that looked just like theirs. It was just sort of like, okay, I like that eye. Oh, I like the way that mouth is. So, anyway, so while I'm talking, I've got my basic monster sketched in. And so just was, did the body, added some arms and legs and eyes, the horns, and then, trying out different things. So yesterday I did more square-like teeth. Today's pointy, sharp teeth. Yesterday, sharp claws. Today, more like stubby fingers. Yesterday, he had claws for his toes. Today, it's more like kind of like an elephant's foot. Kind of like these are toenails sticking out. Not going to put a lot of the little details in, just like yesterday, because I want to go ahead and outline it. So I'm grab my Pitt Artist pen, one of my favorite pens. And I see my internet is acting up again. It's like when I got on, it seemed like, the internet was all jumping all over the place. So hopefully it won't be too bad. And then I'm always recording these. And so I always upload them to YouTube. It's one of the reasons that I decided like I wasn't going to live stream as much, because that's one of the things that kind of really bugs me about it. And we have decent internet here, but sometimes it can be unreliable. And so then I get all worked up because I want this to be a good experience for you, the viewers, those of you that have decided to tune in. So, but what I find is that usually the voice is okay. Usually the voice comes through clearly, but sometimes the image is a little bit glitchy. So hopefully it's behaving enough today. So yeah, I'm using my super fine black Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pen. These are India ink, and they're some of my favorites. I used them all throughout September in that daily challenge. The nice thing is that they are waterproof, so if I wanted to paint over this, and I'm going to do some of that later, what I've thought about is maybe kind of breaking this down into sections, like thinking about, focus on drawing first, and then throw in some painting next, and then some collage, and then finally some sculptural things. So that way it's not just me sitting here drawing with the same materials, doing the same thing every day. But, as an artist, we do that. I mean, I'll sit and draw 5 or 6 different monsters or more, and do a whole series of them. So I think that's what I'm going to do. Just sort of start off doing a series of just pen and ink drawings, and then maybe move into some paint with it. So yeah, that's why I like these pens, because I can use them with the paint. But just, I love the variety that you can get. And, monsters they're not real. So you can get really creative with them. You can give your monster a head. Like, my monsters are very much like the minions, like I mentioned yesterday. So the head is kind of part of the body. But you don't have to do it that way. You can do it your own way. So sometimes I see folks will, give the monster two heads with kind of long snake-like necks. Sometimes I've seen folks make them more like an animal with four legs or six legs. So I use this thinner pen just to kind of establish the drawing, and then I can take my eraser and erase. I do want to be careful because wherever I was last is going to be wet, and I could end up accidentally smudging the ink, which has happened before. So that's one of the reasons I use the thinner pen at first, is just because it dries a little bit faster. And so as I erase, it does kind of, I guess it kind of rubs off, takes off a little bit of the ink. And I mentioned this yesterday, that's why I don't start off with the big fat pens first. Is that if I do the thin one, then I can do all my erasing and then go back and thicken the lines. I'm just taking my time, going slowly. A lot of people want to rush doing this. So yeah, when I first got into this, I was teaching elementary school, and I started sharing it with my kids, with my students, and they loved it. It was just that thing, like anytime we did a new project and I introduced a new material, I would just make a monster to show them. And if they want to do a monster, they could. If they want to do something else, they could. So, you don't have to do a monster. So if you're like, oh, I don't really want to do a monster, you don't have to. This is just kind of for me to hold myself accountable. And so by live streaming, and I'm going to do the live streaming Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And then I'm going to do recorded videos the other weekdays, maybe weekends. We'll see about the weekends. So just a nice little drawing. So yesterday I was using the thicker pen. I'm going to stick with this pen, and just to kind of show in case people are like, well, I don't have all the fancy pens with the fancy tips. If you just have one pen or a pencil, or even if you're like, oh, I just have colored pencil, and you're just using a black colored pencil, what I find is that you can still do thick lines. And it's pretty simple. You just take your time. And even with this thinner pen, I don't know if you can see it, I kind of do a double line and fill it in. So just kind of go back in little sections. I try not to do big sections if I'm doing it this way. And then don't be afraid to turn your paper. I don't know if I did that much yesterday. But by turning my paper, I can put the paper in a more comfortable position. And I'm always kind of thinking about where my hand is, because if I'm turning it and rubbing over where I just put the ink down, it can smear. So I do want to be careful of that. It's another reason to turn my paper. So, if I'm like, oh, well, I didn't do this arm, I can turn them completely upside down. But I do find it interesting that sometimes beginning artists don't really think about turning their paper or turning their canvas so that they can reach things a little bit better. I just kind of find that kind of going in a diagonal direction is just much more comfortable for me. And I'm one of these people that when I draw, my elbow is firmly planted on the table. I know, like when I was a kid and learning to write, like keep your elbow off the table, and I just could never do that. And I just like having that firmness as I draw. So I'm really just kind of using my fingers and maybe sometimes my hand. I don't know, I never really gave it much thought about like how I draw. I just find that whenever I'm teaching and I'm sharing, just like all of a sudden I'll realize something. And sometimes I think that just we as humans in general kind of just feel like, oh, I gotta get this done as quick as I can. And that there's something about like if I can do it quicker, then it's better. And there's something like when you develop your skill that you can do things pretty quickly and it'll look good. Sometimes it'll look okay. But if I can take my time and give myself that time. So just like my September challenge, I'm giving myself a limit. I'm giving myself a time limit of about an hour. So yesterday's was, I finished it up well before the hour. But it's just kind of like no more than an hour. If it's less, that's fine. But I'm trying to get some different thicknesses with my pen. So that way I have some thinner lines and I have some thicker lines. I tend to do the thicker or the thickest lines around the very outside of the monster. And so I might go back over some of the lines, like here around the eye. I think like with this one, I'm just going to go around one time. So that way it doesn't really make it much thicker, it makes it a little bit darker. And then maybe this I'll go around and maybe make it just a little bit thicker, but not a lot. And for the eye, for the outside of the eye, that I think that's going to be like the most important part. So I really want to make that stand out. So if that's really thick, that's a good thing. I think one of the reasons I like to do at least this kind, like with the pen, is that I really kind of just get lost in thickening up the lines. It takes me a little while. Yeah, I often will use the thicker pens, but I just try to take my time. So I don't really concern myself with the details. I'm trying to do like one thing at a time. And I'm really trying to think about the monster all at once. And so, when I sketched it in with pencil, I sketched the whole thing in. And then when I outlined it all with the one pen. And now that I'm thickening the lines, I'm going around to all the lines. I think a lot of times when beginning artists are thinking about their artwork, a lot of times they think like, oh, well, I'll sit here and I'll do the eye and I'll focus and just do all the eye. And they try to complete the eye. And then they go, okay, I'll move to this eye. And they work and work and work and complete that eye. And then it's like, oh, I'll work on the teeth and I'll work on the body. And so what happens is you end up focusing on just one part at a time. And often you don't really pay attention to how those parts are really relating. And so if I'm shading, and probably I'll end up doing one with pencil one day. If I'm shading, I want to kind of shade the whole thing. I'm not just going to shade one part and try to get it perfect and finished before I move on. I start shading lightly in the whole thing. So just like I'm going around to this whole image and outlining it, I want to focus on the outline first. Because what that does, it allows me to keep the line consistent. I'm focusing on just that one thing. If I'm focusing on like the eye, I might be like, okay, I outlined it. Now I'm going to do the pattern, and then I'm going to do some shading, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And you spend all that time that when you go back to another part, you may have forgotten, or your style's changed a little bit, so that you focus on all these other things, and so to then stop to refocus on the quality of the line, your lines might end up looking different. Maybe you get impatient and you're like, oh, well, I just don't want to do those thick lines. And so then you end up with inconsistencies in the drawing. So if you're tuning in and you want to pop into the comments and say hi, I always appreciate seeing who's out there, and if you want to mention where you're from, that's always great too. And if you have any questions or comments, I do try to take a look at the comments, and I haven't yet, but I will. I find with this, it's a little bit more harder to engage with the comments without just completely stopping. Whereas if I'm using paint, a lot of times I will use a hair dryer to dry the paint, and that makes a perfect opportunity to kind of hold the hair dryer in one hand and check the comments. But I do appreciate any comments and any questions, and I try to answer any questions that I can. And if I don't get a chance to answer questions during the live stream, I try to go back and respond with something written in the comments. So slowly getting the outline done. I think this can just allow us to slow down a little bit. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about how art can be very soothing and relaxing. I don't want to say the word therapeutic because some people will say, oh, well, art therapy. And it's like, well, no, I'm not a therapist. I'm an artist and a teacher. So, yeah, I think that art can be good for you in a way to help you relax, especially something like this where you just focus, I'm taking my time, going slowly. It's about the doing, not the getting it done. There's something else that I like about just using this thinner pen. Um, as I use it to kind of fill in the lines and make them thicker, I often will leave just little slivers of white showing. And it's one of those things where it's like, I could get real fussy and be like, oh no, it has to be solid black. But to me, it also kind of just leaves a little bit of evidence of the process. And sometimes with the really thick pens, you get a thick line. But it's all an even thickness. And it's not too uneven. And having these little places where I didn't quite color it in all the way just leaves a little bit of imperfection. It leaves a little bit of the process showing through. And it's those imperfections, I think, that always add to the art. I know a lot of times we have that inner critic that pops up and says, no, it's got to be perfect. And it's like, well, I'm a human being. I can't do something perfectly. I can be neat about it. I can have good craftsmanship. And so there's this acceptance of like, okay, I'm going to accept that my hand's not perfect. I'm going to accept that line's a little crooked and that there are little imperfections in it. Just taking some time to slow down and spend a little time working on art. I think too often we're like an instant gratification society. That like, oh well, I've got it. The payoff has to be big and it's got to be quick. So now I'm just starting to think about details. Put some lines, some textures, some patterns. So I always kind of think about human eyes when I'm doing the monsters and thinking about what the iris, looks like, what the pupils look like. Yesterday I did some like little marks in this little part. I think I'm just going to do little kind of dashes that go around. Just little texture. So because I'm just doing the pen, having some areas that are filled in, not filled in solid black. I mean, I could if I wanted to. So, I filled in the pupil part of the eyes solid black. But filling in with textures and patterns. And you can even do some shading. With pen and ink, shading is a little bit more difficult because, I'm doing black lines. So you do something called hatching and cross-hatching. So I think I kind of went a little dark on his teeth, but oh well. Nothing I could really do about it now. So he's just got dark teeth. Do a line for his lip. I think, he's got, his teeth are kind of dark, so why not, I think maybe his horns need to have that kind of same texture. So these lines are all kind of going in the same direction. And since they're going like the length of the horn, they're going in that kind of direction. It's going to kind of give it a flow, like it's growing out. Do the same thing over here. So if I want it darker, I just put more lines closer together, overlap some of the lines. If I want it lighter, just fewer lines, space them out. So this is what we call hatching, if you're not familiar with that term. All the lines are, well, in this case, they're mostly parallel. They don't really crisscross. If the lines cross, we call that cross-hatching. So that just kind of gives them a little bit of value, makes things so it's not all white. Do a series of little stripe-like lines on this part. I think I need the same kind of lines on his toenails as I do the horns and the teeth. I'm going to give him little fingernails. A few little wrinkles on his knees. So I think I did some of these little dash lines. I think I'm going to go ahead and do some around his eye. Yesterday I did lots of like little circles and dots. I just kind of feel like he needs to have something around to separate his eye from his body. Yeah, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's a bit of a furry texture. Hadn't really thought about making him furry, but now he is. So I can make this furry texture appear like the fur is going in different directions, like it's lying in a different direction, just by changing the direction of the mark. And then maybe down here it's more up and down. Because I want this to feel more organic, I'm trying not to do like a very even regular pattern of these little marks. So I try to let my hand dance around, and if some of the marks overlap, that's fine. And then some are small and some are longer. That's why I'm not just like kind of going across the top, and then a lot of times if I just go in one direction, I end up really seeing a pattern as I get done with it. So just trying to make my hand dance around a little bit. And I'm just focusing on the monster, taking my time and really doing a lot. And I'm not really worried so much about the background. But if you wanted to do something in there, you wanted to make your monster be in a certain place, you could, or you could just fill it in with patterns or lines or shapes. It's a nice thing. There's no right way of doing it. Okay, so I kind of I like that little furry texture. I think I'm just going to keep it on there. I think his arms and his legs aren't going to have it. But I want something on his arms. Trying to think. My first thought was to do stripes, but I don't want to just do plain stripes. I did that yesterday, but I'm going to do kind of these little jagged lines. So they're like stripes that come in and end. And maybe there's a couple. Sometimes we might think of these like, partly like tiger stripes. So he's looking pretty good, but I think I want his eyes to stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to thicken this line a little bit that goes around. Okay. I'm starting to feel like he's getting pretty done. Yeah, I think so. So I'm going to call him done. I'm going to go ahead and sign it. Over the years, I've developed an artist signature. It's just E.M. Scott. So it's Eric Matthew Scott. And then I just put the date. Some artists sign their whole name. Some artists just use their last name. I don't know. I think I did the E.M. Scott just because of one of my email addresses. Actually, I just kind of like that. I use that as one of mine. So it's always weird to kind of think about where your artist signature comes from. So there he is. Day number 2. Monster number 2. So, yeah, I mean, just making a monster, and monsters are, I have fun doing them. I think that's what it's about. It's oftentimes I hear people like, oh, making art must be so much fun. And, yeah, making art is fun, but, when you're doing some art that's like very thoughtful and very serious, sometimes it can be a little frustrating because you're trying to deliver a certain message or communicate something very specific, and sometimes you just struggle with that, and art can be a struggle. I think with the monsters, for me, it's a bit like, oh, this is just a little bit of fun, not too serious. Just sit down and just create these crazy little cuddly, cute, cranky little things, and I'm not saying that they're not serious. Maybe there's a way to think about them in a more serious way. But I think just for me personally, thinking about that difference between the artwork that I was making like last month and then the artwork for these monsters, this is a lot of fun. And for me, it's about bringing joy to myself and then just bringing joy to other people with it. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, any comments, pop them in the comments, and I will try to respond and answer. And I appreciate whoever had some time to come and hang out with me today. And like all my live streams, this is going to be saved on Facebook so people can watch it later, and then I'll also put it on YouTube. So, oh, and don't forget to post if you're making some monsters. I'd love to see them. Post them in the comments or post them on social media and tag me. I'd love to see them, and I know other people would too. So, anyway, appreciate it, and thank you so much for joining in. And as always, happy creating.